everybody. How's it going today? Thank you so much for joining us for your lunch hour with us. This, of course, is Live at Lunch. My name is John Schaefer, and this is the program where we highlight some of the amazing content created by the Harris County Public Library. All things that you can check out on our YouTube and Facebook pages, which, by the way, now would be a perfect time to go ahead and click those likes, click those subscribes, and definitely on the YouTube, you want to click that little bell icon so that way you get notified when we go live. And we do go live every Friday at lunchtime right now. We have got an amazing show for you today. I'm very excited about. Now, as you know, this year is the centennial for the Harris County Public Library, celebrating 100 years of service to the county. And each month in this year, we've been celebrating a different decade. And you've been seeing those programs here. So today is the day for the 1960s, man. Groovy. Really good program. Very excited about it. I'm telling you what, I'm going to come back and talk to you in a minute, but we're going to get it started right now. So I present to you your viewing pleasure, the history of the 60s in 9 books.
The 1960s in America were a tumultuous time. The decade saw the flowering of the African American civil rights movement, widespread protests against the Vietnam War, and a deep questioning of long-held beliefs about everything from the nuclear family to the shape of the universe. Along with Black Americans, many other traditionally marginalized communities, including women, LGBTQ, Latinx, people with disabilities, demanded their voices be heard. Many of the books of the era reflected and amplified this cultural upheaval. Join us as we revisit some of the books that shaped the 60s and ask if they are still relevant today, a half-century later. In the 1960s, science fiction and other forms of speculative writing began to be taken more seriously as works of literature rather than purely genre entertainments. Writers like Robert Heinlein, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., and Jorge Luis Borges used the conventions of the genre not only to comment on the social and political climate of the time, but to examine deeper questions about the nature of time and language's ability to shape our perceptions, among others.
Take this word, grok. Its literal meaning, one which I suspect goes back to the origin of the Martian race as thinking creatures, and which throws light on their whole map, is easy. Grok means to drink. Huh? Said Jubal. Mike never says grok when he's just talking about drinking. Just a moment, Mahmoud spoke to Mike in Martian. Mike looked faintly surprised. Grok is drink. But Mike would have agreed, Mahmoud went on, if I had named 100 other English words which we think of as different concepts, even antithetical concepts. Grok means all of these. It means fear, it means love, it means hate, proper hate. For by the Martian map, you cannot hate anything unless you grok it, understand it so thoroughly that you merge with it and it merges with you. Then can you hate, by hating yourself. But this implies that you love it too and cherish it and would not have it otherwise. Then you can hate. And I think Martian hate is an emotion so black that the nearest human equivalent could only be called mild distaste. Mahmoud screwed up his face. Grok means identically equal, the human cliche. This hurts me worse than it does you has a Martian flavor. The Martians seem to know instinctively what we learned painfully from modern physics, that observer interacts with observed through the process of observation. Grok means to understand so thoroughly that the observer becomes part of the observed. To merge, blend, intermarry, lose identity in group experience. It means almost everything that we mean by religion, philosophy, and science, and it means as little to us as color means to a blind man. Mahmoud paused. Jubal, if I chopped you up and made a stew, you and the stew, whatever was in it, would grok, and when I ate you, We would grok together and nothing would be lost, and it would not matter which one of us did the eating. It would to me, Jubal said firmly. You aren't a Martian.
Eight Dresdeners crossed the steel spaghetti of the railroad yard. They were wearing new uniforms. They had been sworn into the army the day before. They were boys and men past middle-aged, and 2 veterans who had been shot to pieces in Russia. Their assignment was to guard 100 American prisoners of war who would work as contract labor. A grandfather and his grandson were in the squad. The grandfather was an architect. The 8 were grim as they approached the boxcars containing their wards. They knew what sick and foolish soldiers they themselves appeared to be. One of them actually had an artificial leg and carried not only a loaded rifle, but a cane. Still, they were expected to earn obedience and respect from tall, cocky, murderous American infantrymen who had just come from all the killing at the front. And then they saw Billy Pilgrim in his blue toga and silver shoes with his hands in a muff. He looked at least 60 years old. Next to Billy was little Paul Lazaro with a broken arm. He was fizzing with rabies. Next to Lazaro was the poor old high school teacher, Edgar Derby, mournfully pregnant with patriotism and middle age and imaginary wisdom, and so on. The 8 ridiculous Dresdeners ascertained that these 100 ridiculous creatures really were American fighting men fresh from the front. They smiled, and then they laughed. Their terror evaporated. There was nothing to be afraid of. Here were more crippled human beings, just like themselves. Here was light opera.
There are no nouns in Slend's conjectural Ursprache, from which the present language is and the dialects are derived. There are impersonal verbs modified by monosyllabic suffixes or prefixes with an adverbial value. For example, there is no word corresponding to the word moon, but there is a verb which in English would be to moon or to moonate. The moon rose above the river is hlur ufang axis mla, or literally upward behind the on-streaming it mooned. The preceding applies to the languages of the southern hemisphere. In those of the northern hemisphere, on whose Ursprache there is very little data in the 11th volume, the prime unit is not the verb with the monosyllabic adjective. The noun is formed by an accumulation of adjectives. They do not say moon, but rather round, airy light on dark, or pale orange of the sky, or any other such combination. In the example selected, the mass of adjectives refers to a real object, but this is purely fortuitous. The literature of this hemisphere, like Menon's subsistent world, abounds in ideal objects, which are convoked and dissolved in a moment according to poetic needs. At times, they are determined by mere simultaneity. There are objects composed of 2 terms, one of visual and another of auditory character, the color of the rising sun and the faraway cry of a bird. There are objects of many terms, the sun and the water on a swimmer's chest, the vague, tremulous rose color we see with our eyes closed, the sensation of being carried along by a river and also by sleep. These second-degree objects can be combined with others. Through the use of certain abbreviations, the process is practically infinite. There are famous poems made up of one enormous word. This word forms a poetic object created by the author. The fact that no one believes in the reality of nouns paradoxically causes their number to be unending. The languages of Slend's northern hemisphere contain all the nouns of the Indo-European languages, and many others as well.
I believe Stranger in a Strange Land is still relevant today because even though it was written back in the 60s, it's still, it has flavors of what we're dealing with today. You know, where does our food come from? Is TV bad or good? Where do we get our information? Who's really on your side? That's very much still relevant today.
Slaughterhouse-Five is definitely still relevant today. It's an anti-war book, and war is always going to be the same. It's always going to be absurd. There's a quote early on in the book where the author is asked, why are you writing a book about anti-war? Why don't you just write a book about glaciers? Because glaciers, they never change, and war is never going to change either. It's always going to be absurd.
Yeah, so it's actually been really special to me. It was recommended to me by my best friend my freshman year of college. I had just read House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, and I was on a real kind of weird fiction bender. And this was recommended to me as something with a similar kind of blend of nonfiction and fiction styles. I was reading mostly academic texts at the time. I was in college, and that style just really resonated with me. And it's wild that this book came out nearly 50 years before House of Leaves and a lot of the other kind of big contemporary weird fiction titles. But it just still feels so fresh and so innovative. Nobody does it like Borges does it.
Wow. Very cool. And it goes without saying, by the way, that those three books and all the books we're going to be talking about today are available at your Harris County Public Library local branch. This, of course, Kurt Van Vonnegut's right here. Speaking of which, you might have noticed that we are at a different branch than I usually am. That is because in the 1960s, Harris County opened up two different branches. They opened up Stratford, which is a beautiful library you should check out if you're in the area, but also this one right here that I'm at. This, of course, is the West University branch. So definitely check it out when you get the chance. Come by and see us. Also, real quick, I want to remind you before we dive back into the 60s books program, we have a show coming up next Friday on May 21st, and it's all about mandala rock painting. And this, of course, is continuing on in our celebration of AAPI month, which is Asian American Pacific Islander month. So we'll be doing some mandala rock painting, a lot of fun. So, but let's not waste any more time. Let's get right back into it and talk about another three books.
Satisfaction with and alienation from the conformist culture of the 1950s manifested during the 1960s. In openly political statements on a broad range of topics, authors spoke for and to communities who were largely excluded from mainstream political discourse. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time galvanized the ongoing civil rights movement. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring largely jump-started what would become the women's liberation and environmental movements of later decades.
The image of woman that emerges from this big, pretty magazine is young and frivolous, almost childlike, fluffy and feminine, passive, gaily content in a world of bedroom and kitchen, sex, babies, and home. The magazine surely does not leave out the sex. The only passion, the pursuit, the only goal a woman is permitted is the pursuit of a man. It is crammed full of food, clothing, cosmetics, furniture, and the physical bodies of young women. But where is the world of thought and ideas, the life of the mind and spirit? In the magazine image, women do not work except housework and work to keep their bodies beautiful and to get and keep a man. This was the image of the American woman in the year Castro led a revolution in Cuba and men were trained to travel into outer space. The year that the African continent brought forth new nations. And a plane whose speed is greater than the speed of sound broke up a summit conference. The year artists picketed a great museum in a protest against the homogeneity of abstract art. Physicists explored the concept of antimatter. Astronomers, because of new radio telescopes, had to alter their concepts of the expanding universe. Biologists made a breakthrough in the fundamental chemistry of life. and Negro youth in Southern schools forced the United States for the first time since the Civil War to face a moment of democratic truth. But this magazine, published for over 5 million American women, almost all of whom have been through high school and nearly half to college, contained almost no mention of the world beyond the home. In the second half of the 20th century in America, woman's world was confined to her own body and beauty, the charming of a man, the bearing of babies, and the physical care and serving of husband, children, and home. And this was no anomaly of a single issue of a single woman's magazine.
The whole process of spraying seems caught up in an endless spiral. Since DDT was released for civilian use, a process of escalation has been going on in which ever more toxic materials must be found. This is happening because insects, in a triumphant vindication of Darwin's principle of the survival of the fittest, have evolved super races immune to the particular insecticide used. Hence, a deadlier one has always to be developed, and then a deadlier one than that. It has happened also because destructive insects often undergo a flare-back or resurgence after spraying in numbers greater than before. Thus, the chemical war is never won, and all life is caught in its violent crossfire. Along with the possibility of the extinction of mankind by nuclear war, the central problem of our age has therefore become the contamination of man's total environment with such substances of incredible potential for harm, substances that accumulate in the tissues of plants and animals and even penetrate the germ cells to shatter or alter the very material of heredity upon which the shape of the future depends. Some would-be architects of our future look toward a time when it will be possible to alter the human germplasm by design. But we may easily be doing so now by inadvertence, for many chemicals, like radiation, bring about gene mutations. It is ironic to think that man might determine his own future by something so seemingly trivial as the choice of an insect spray. All this has been risked. For what? Future historians may well be amazed by our distorted sense of proportion. How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and deaths even to their own kind?
This endless struggle to achieve and reveal and confirm a human identity, human authority, yet contains for all its horror something very beautiful. I do not mean to be sentimental about suffering. Enough is certainly as good as a feast, but people who cannot suffer can never grow up, can never discover who they are. That man who is forced each day to snatch his manhood, his identity out of the fire of human cruelty that rages to destroy, it knows, if he survives his effort, and even if he does not survive it, something about himself and human life that no school on earth, and indeed no church, can teach. He achieves his own authority, and that is unshakable. This is because in order to save his life, he is forced to look beneath appearances, to take nothing for granted, to hear the meaning behind the words. If no one continually surviving the worst that life can bring, one eventually ceases to be controlled by a fear of what life can bring. Whatever it brings must be borne. And at this level of experience, one's bitterness begins to become palatable, and hatred becomes too heavy a sack to carry. The apprehension of life here is so briefly and inadequately sketched, has been the experience of generations of Negroes. And it helps to explain how they have endured and how they have been able to produce children of kindergarten age who can walk through mobs to get to school. It demands great force and great cunning continually to assault the mighty and indifferent fortress of white supremacy. As Negroes in this country have done so long, It demands great spiritual resilience not to hate the haters whose foot is on your neck, and an even greater miracle of perception and charity not to teach your child to hate. The Negro boys and girls who are facing mobs today come out of a long line of improbable aristocrats, the genuine aristocrats this country has produced. I say this country because their frame of reference was totally American. They were hewing out of the mountain of white supremacy the stone of their individuality. I have great respect for that unsung army of black men and women who trudged down back lanes and entered back doors saying, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," in order to acquire a new roof for the schoolhouse, new books, a new chemistry lab, more beds for the dormitories, more dormitories. They did not like saying "yes, sir," and "no, ma'am," but the country was in no hurry to educate the Negroes. These black men and women knew that their job had to be done, and they put their pride in their pockets in order to do it. It is very hard to believe that they were in any way inferior to the white men and women who opened these back doors. It is very hard to believe that those men and women raising their children, eating their greens, crying their curses, weeping their tears, singing their songs, making their love as the sun rose, as the sun set, were in any way inferior to the white men and women who crept over to share these splendors after the sun went down. But we must avoid the European error. We must not suppose that because the situation, the ways, the perception of black people so radically different from those of whites, they were racially superior. I am proud of these people, not because of their color, but because of their intelligence and their spiritual force and their beauty. The country should be proud of them too, but alas, not many people in the country even know of their existence. And the reason for this ignorance is that a knowledge of the role these people played and play in American life would reveal more about America to Americans than Americans wish to know.
Yes, the feminine mystique is still relevant in today's world. Women are still paid less than men in equal roles with equal experience, equal education. Women still bear the majority of the responsibility of the work at home and the care of the children, even if both parents are working. And women's magazines still place a lot of emphasis on looking good for your man, keeping the house, cooking him his meals. So yes, I do think it's very relevant, even today. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
Unfortunately, yes, it is. Even though it is a classic book that started the movement of environmental awareness, we're still having folks bury their heads in the sand with regard to climate change, and still experimenting with poisons to get rid of household pests even.
Yes, I do believe that the book is still relevant today. There are many misconceptions that are still happening in the society that showcase African Americans in a way that is not very complimentary. And I do feel that there are certain things that are still happening that need to be talked about, and we do need to fix these misconceptions.
Wow, it is amazing to me how relevant some of these books are that are still in today's date from the 1960s. I personally have a lot of reading ahead of me. It's a good thing. I've got a library card with the Harris County Public Library, so I know where I can get all those books that you've just heard about. Definitely one, if you want to find this program again or one of our many, many, many other great programs, you can find it on our YouTube page. And I would direct you to go to our website, though, the Harris County Public Library website, which is hcpl.net. You can always just check out the virtual programs page. We have a list of all the great live programs and all the programs coming up. You can look at that and see what's coming up. Make sure you mark your calendar, and you can go ahead and put reminders on there so they will notify you when they are going live, so you don't forget it. You don't forget this program or any others. We'll talk some more about some great stuff we have coming up after this next segment. We've got one more segment. This, of course, the name of this program is The History of the 60s in 9 books. The Histories of the 60s in 9 books. So why don't we go ahead and finish it out strong on our last 3 books.
For other writers, the social and political upheavals in the culture at large were gateways to the exploration of identity and their own unique voices. The political made personal. Joan Didion and Tom Wolfe helped to create what became known as the New Journalism, in which writers eschewed the pretense of journalistic objectivity and used techniques of fiction writers to reinvent long-form nonfiction. Maya Angelou used the memoir to comment and expand upon the purely political outlines of the civil rights and women's movements.
It all comes back. Perhaps it's difficult to see the value in having oneself back in that kind of mood, but I do see it. I think we are well advised to keep on nodding terms with the people we used to be, whether we find them attractive company or not. Otherwise, they turn up unannounced and surprise us. They come hammering on the mind's door at 4 a.m. of a bad night, demanding to know who deserted them, who betrayed them, who is going to make amends. We forget all too soon the things we thought we could never forget. We forget the loves and the betrayals alike, forget what we whispered and what we screamed, forget who we were. I have already lost touch with a couple of people that I used to be. One of them, a 17-year-old, presents little threat. Although it would be some interest to me to know again what it feels like to sit on a river levee, drinking vodka and orange juice, and listening to Les Paul and Mary Ford and their echoes sing How High the Moon on the car radio. You see, I still have the scenes, but I can no longer perceive myself among those present, no longer could even improvise the dialogue. The other one, a 23-year-old, bothers me more. She was always a good deal of trouble, and I suspect she will reappear again when I least want to see her. Skirts too long, shy to the point of aggravation, always the injured party, full of recriminations and little hurts, and stories I do not want to hear again. At once saddening me and angering me with her vulnerability and her ignorance. An apparition all the more insistent for being so long banished.
The first thing you knew about it was a squirrel dropped an acorn from a tree outside. Only it was tremendously loud and sounded like it was not outside, but right in the room with him. And not actually a sound either, but a great suffusing presence, visual, almost tactile, a great impacting of blue all around him. And suddenly he was in a realm of consciousness he had never dreamed of before. And it was not a dream, but a delirium, but part of his awareness. He looked at the ceiling. It begins moving. Panic! And yet there is no panic. The ceiling is moving, not in a crazed swirl, but along its own planes of light and shadow and surface. Not nearly so nice and smooth as Plaster or Super Plaster Man intended, with infallible carpenter-level bubbles sliding in dim honey caro syrup tube. Not so foolproof as you thought, bub. Little lumps and ridges up there, bub. And lines like spines on crests of waves of white desert movie sand, each one with MGM's shadow long shot of the ominous Arab coming over on the next crest. For only the sinister Saracen can see the road, and you didn't know how many subplots you left up there, Plaster Man, trying to smooth it all out, all of it, with your bubble in a honey tube carpenter's level, to make us all down there look up and see nothing but ceiling, because we all know ceiling. Because it has a name, ceiling. Therefore, it is nothing but a ceiling. No room for Arabs up there in Levelland, Plaster Man. Suddenly, he's like a ping pong ball in a flood of sensory stimuli. Heart beating, blood coursing, breath suspiring, teeth grating, hand moving over the percale sheet over the thousands of minute wharfy woofings like a brush fire. Sun glow in the highlight on a stainless steel rod. Quite a little movie you have going on in that highlight there, Hondo. Technicolors. Pick each one out like fishing for neon gumballs with a steam shovel in the Fun Time arcade. A ping pong ball in a flood of sensory stimuli, all quite ordinary, but revealing themselves for the first time and happening now. As if for the first time he has entered a moment in his life and known exactly what is happening to his senses. Now, at this moment. And with each new discovery, it is as if he has entered into all of it himself, is one with it. The movie white desert of the ceiling becoming something rich, personal, his, beautiful beyond description, like an orgasm behind the eyeballs, and Arabs behind the eyelids, eyelid movies, room for them and a lot more in the 5 billion thoughts per second stroboscope synapses. His Arab heroes, fine daily double horsehair mustaches wrapped about the orbicularis auris of their mouths. Face. The doctor comes back in and, marvelous, poor, tight, cone-ass doc, Kesey can now see into him. Miraculous. He could truly see into people for the first time. And yes, that little capsule sliding blissfully down his gullet was LSD.
A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade winds soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn-bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But the cage bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom.
The book is absolutely still relevant today. The human experience is universal and eternal, and the feelings that Miss Didion portrays in this work are still relevant today, and I think they will always be relevant.
The electric Kool-Aid acid test by Tom Wolfe is incredibly relevant today, It is a tremendous example of new journalism, which was a very important style of nonfiction, and it manages to capture a very important time in American culture in a way that a more straight telling couldn't have through the use of poetic language and literary devices. Tom Wolfe manages to capture Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and the way that they perceived the world in a way that no one else really had in nonfiction, and preserves the moment for, the world now.
Yes, I do believe that this book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, is very relevant today because it speaks to a lot of things that a lot of people are going through. Maya Angelou, as a child, went through a lot of adversaries and some obstacles, and it speaks of hope. Even in light of the Me Too movement, if you look at what she went through, it's something that speaks to all women and young people who have gone through some sort of abuse in their past, and it does give them hope and gives them the confidence that they can do this, that they can conquer any kind of obstacle that comes their way.
Wow, there you have it. The history of the 1960s in 9 books. Oh my gosh, congratulations, guys, on that. Such a great project. That video, of course, available along with many, many other great videos on our Harris County Public Library YouTube page. And of course, you want to check us out at hcpl.net under the Virtual Programs tab. And that's where you'd see an advertisement for our next coming program. We are going to be here next Friday, same time, 12 o'clock. We're going to be talking about doing some crafting with some Mandela rock painting. Also, and then the Friday after that, we've got an very special anime episode, which I'm excited about because I know nothing about anime, but I'm getting ready to learn. So, guys, once again, thank you for joining us for Live at Lunch. My name is John Schaefer, and we will see you next Friday at 12 o'clock. Bye-bye.